And thank you, Joe.
Shall I turn the light?
Give me, you
off
could dim
or
it,
leave on?
yeah, if you could dim it a little, that'd be
Sure can.
great.
Sure can. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
As Joe mentioned, I am someone who has a deep and abiding love of the history of the Old West, and much like he mentioned as well, I will look at movies and kind of think they didn't get it right. So part of what I wanted to do today was dispel some of the myths and misconceptions that Hollywood would have us all believe as to how the West really was won. We've all heard the phrase, we've seen the movie most likely, and the first question we need to get to is, how was the West won and who did it? And there are a number of separate candidates. We could talk about the cowboys because that's what everybody thinks when they think of the Old West. And despite what Hollywood would have us believe, the cowboys really were nothing more than cattle drovers. They were skilled. I'm not taking anything away from that, but they were just laborers who moved cattle to market, whether it was to the final destination, from ranch to ranch, from grazing land to grazing land. So they were basically itinerant workers. Some people would argue that the railroaders were the folks who actually won the West. And in a similar sense, the railroad traveled through the land and had some outposts here and there, train stations and whatnot, but didn't really conquer the land itself. They just moved goods through it. Third group, and I think we've all seen these, were the pioneers, the folks who actually moved west and settled the land. They were the average, everyday mom and pop farmers and ranchers who created permanent habitation that actually tamed the land. And so when I was thinking about this, I pretty much decided on the idea that settlement of the land was probably the most important factor in taming the Wild West. Now, a little bit of background before we get to the guns. The opportunity to tame the West came about as a result of the Homestead Act of 1862, which Abraham Lincoln signed in the midst of the Civil War, very early, right after the Southern states seceded. And it was designed to distribute a lot of public land that at the time the government didn't have a real use for into private hands so that the land could actually be used productively. And it was a true success. In the 68 years from 62 to 1930 that land was available under this act in the lower 48 states, it actually lasted a little longer up in Alaska. 270 million acres, roughly 10% of the US was claimed and settled. Now, who was able to partake in this? Anyone over 21 years of age or who was the head of a household could apply for this land as long as they met two qualifications. They had to be a citizen of the US or make a legal declaration that they intended to become a citizen of the US. And two, given the timing of the enactment, they had to declare that they would not fight or would not aid the enemies of the United States. So, if you met these two criteria, for a nominal filing fee, you could go west and claim 160 acres of land, so long as you lived on that land continuously once you got there for 5 years. That was all it took. And as a result of this, settlers from all walks of life, farmers from back east who didn't own any land back there because land was a much scarcer commodity. Immigrants, a surprising number of single women and widows, war widows, and as well as formerly enslaved people, all took this opportunity to head west. Now, to prepare themselves for the trek west, they needed to acquire, plan, and transport everything they would need to go create a new homestead. Food, clothes, tools. And so, it was a relatively expensive proposition beyond just this cheap land, but it also required that you kind of plan it out, because you were generally taking a wagon, maybe two if you were lucky, and didn't have a lot of space to take things. So when it came to tools, the idea was the more usage you could get out of a single tool, like the multi-use tools that we all keep on our belts nowadays, the more valuable that tool would be. And one of those tools was, of course, the gun. You could use it for hunting. You could use it to protect yourself against bad people. You could use it to protect your inevitable farm from various pests, crows who were going to try to eat your corn, coyotes who were going to try to eat your herd. So guns were pretty important. Now the question we get to then is, what kind of guns did these settlers take with them? What were available to them that they could use for all these purposes? Now, as Joe pointed out, Hollywood creates a bit of a misconception based on a lot of different factors, but they would probably have all of us believe that everyone in the West had an 1873 Winchester repeating rifle and an 1873 Colt single action Army on their hip. And they would make you believe that the trek west looked something like this. Okay? Granny in the back of a Conestoga wagon, holding her 1873 Winchester, fighting off the evil Indians, in air quotes, of course. Now, there are so many things wrong about this. I'm not going to try to dispel all the myths, but the one we're going to stick on here is that really wasn't the gun that any of the settlers out west were buying and bringing with them on the wagon train westward, for two very, very solid reasons. First, most of the settlers were cash strapped. They didn't own much east, and there were other things to spend money on to equip themselves for the trek west rather than expensive firearms. And more importantly, it's an 1873 rifle. It wasn't even available until almost a decade after the war was over. So, not the kind of gun that was being used. So the question becomes, what kind of gun did they use? Why is this not? Nope. Well, that more represents the reality. This was actually taken in the 1860s in an Arkansas settler camp. And as you can see, and we'll get into actually what they are, but the two guns in the picture held by the gentleman in the center and the boy off to the left clearly weren't 1873 Winchesters and weren't even lever action guns. We'll talk about what I think they are and what they look like in this pretty hazy picture, but that gets to the idea. So getting back to the idea of what guns were available for pioneers heading west to places like Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, the Rockies, even California. in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War? Well, the first guns that I want to talk about were hunting rifles. As we talked, many of the, boy, that jumped 7. Slides for no reason. I'm sorry, I apologize for the technical difficulties. As I mentioned, a lot of the settlers were former farmers from the east who didn't have the means to acquire land there and saw the lands of the west as a cheap alternative to stake their claim. And what did they have available to them? Well, from their time on the farms in the east, they had hunting rifles, which they used around the farm. These were mostly muzzle loaders, either flintlock or caplock ignition, and they had various styles. This is of the standard Pennsylvania, Kentucky long rifle, but they also had the Jaeger, some will say Jagger, German impression shorter rifles, and of course half-stock Hawken style rifles. These were useful for hunting and for protecting your home and herd once you got settled into your homestead in the West. But even more important than these, given the timing, because a lot of the folks that I mentioned, new immigrants to the country, former enslaved people, didn't have, why does this keep happening? Access to hunting guns. They just, they weren't farmers or whatever, but they needed something. And that's where they got to the idea of surplus military muskets. There were millions, literally millions, manufactured during the war. And by the end, when the military is doing its usual drawdown at the end of a conflict, there were large numbers that were surplus and that were available cheap. So, what kind of muskets were there? First, there was the Model 1841 rifle, which was actually a pre-Civil War rifle that had a long, active career. It had acquired the nickname Mississippi rifle because it was used by Jefferson Davis's Mississippi Volunteers during the Mexican War of 1846. It was a handsome single-shot 54 caliber percussion gun with a brass patch box. That would be a tongue twister. And as you can see, various brass ornaments. And there were a lot of these that were still used during the Civil War, particularly amongst Confederate sharpshooters. And of course, what would happen is after the war, the Confederate soldiers would surrender their weapons, and there were a lot of these sitting in U.S. military stock that they had no use for. And so they were being sold very cheaply and were easily acquirable to be taken west. There were also, and probably the most numerous, were the U.S. models 1861 and 1863 Springfield rifles. This is the 61, not a whole lot of difference. One of the distinguishing factors was the rounded arched hammer between the 61 and the 63. But this was the standard U.S. long arm of the war. Over 1 million were produced, including quite a number of Confederate variants. In particular, the Richmond musket, which was produced, as they say, in Richmond, but using machinery that was captured by the Confederacy early in the war from Harper's Ferry. So they had the tooling for the gun, they just made the same federal firearm for their troops. These guns, along with approximately 900,000, almost a million, Enfield rifles, constituted what were known as the three-banders because of the three barrel bands on the stock. They were longer. They were a longer rifle. They were heavier. But they were more accurate, and they were ubiquitous during the war and readily available as surplus tools for Western settlers. And as you can guess, given its background as a military weapon, they were perfectly adequate in terms of utility and accuracy for protecting your home and your family, as well as for hunting. Now, one interesting offshoot, which I was surprised during my research when I was going through some of this, was that another gun that was a variant of the Springfields that was relatively prevalent was the 1866 Allen conversion of the 1863 version. Now, during the course of the war, there were a lot of breech loaders that were used, but not by no means in the amount of the muzzle loaders. But following the war, a large number of the 63s were modified as a breech loader. And that's the actual mechanism, which shows they cut into the back of the barrel, installed all the machinery to fire a metallic cartridge, firing pin, and whatnot. And this made these guns much easier to load and fire, increasing your rate of fire way beyond what the simple muzzle loaders would could accomplish. And it was just a matter of literally opening, inserting the cartridge, and firing. These proved to be surprisingly relatively prevalent amongst the settlers, as if a choice was available. Even for a few dollars more, pardon the Western movie reference, there was much more interest in having a gun that you could have fire a metallic cartridge with a decent rate of fire than there was in taking a long arm that was a muzzle loading long arm. However, there were a lot more of those available, and people needed something quick and inexpensive. So both the muzzle loaders and the breech loaders showed up. And in addition, I'll just make one quick observation that we've talked about all these three-band muskets. There were an awful lot of two-band muskets, including the U.S. model 1863 Remington, otherwise known as the Zouave rifle, and the two-band Enfields, which, although not produced in as great a number as the three-banders, were still available and relatively cheap, and actually proved relatively popular given that they were lighter and easier to handle, while they sacrificed very little in terms of firepower or accuracy compared to the three-banders. So these made their way west with the settlers and were used on many of the early homesteads, much like the three-banders. We saw the Allen breech loader, and breech loading carbines and rifles were also very, very popular amongst the settlers heading west. One of the most popular was the 1852 and 1853 versions of the Sharps carbine. This actually is a full stocked rifle model, which there were some of, but the carbines were much much more common. And again, this was much like the Mississippi rifle, a gun with a pre-war history that was also used during the Civil War, and then after the war found its way as surplus into the hands of the Western settlers. Over 30,000 of these were produced, and most of the early carbines were already on the frontier, having been delivered to the 2nd U.S. Dragoons during the late 1850s. Some of the later models actually made their ways into private hands before the war started and were part of the Bleeding Kansas and 1850 border clashes over slavery in the Missouri-Kansas area. So a lot of those guns were already in civilian hands or acquirable by civilians before the war even started, let alone after it was over. Likewise, with the Sharps, there were other government contracts that weren't military contracts. A lot of the government mail contractors in the early Southwest, pre-war, and some of the stagecoach operations were using them for protection. Again, in private hands and probably resellable to settlers once they even got there. They needed to upgrade from their single shot muskets. So these guns were actually, for not having a lot of them, were probably overrepresented in terms of guns that were in the hands of the settlers on the homesteads out west. Above and beyond just the single shots, there were actually a number of lever action carbines and rifles similar to the Winchester, which is personal belief of mine. I have not been able to confirm it in any way, shape, or form, but is what probably led a lot of the Hollywood folks in the 50s and 60s to think that any lever action is an 1873 Winchester, so we can put that in the movie. But there were other earlier versions of lever action carbines and rifles were out there, including, of course, the 1860 Henry. This gun, revolutionary in its own right for a number of reasons I'll get to, but was actually of limited use during the war. There weren't a whole lot of them, and the military powers that be didn't want to put what they thought of as wasteful firepower into the hands of the troops, in that the thought of the time was, if we give them the ability to shoot all these bullets, they won't take their time, they won't aim, they'll just go through all their bullets really quick and then be, either require us to have to buy and ship more bullets, or be completely unarmed with just standing around with empty guns as a battle would progress. However, when it was actually used during the war, it proved to be, and this is actually a quote from one of the Confederate generals, a wicked weapon. It could put up an incredible barrage of fire to an effective range that just hadn't been seen in warfare before that time. And that was because its distinguishing feature, which was later inherited by the Winchester 66 and then the Winchester 73, had a tubular magazine underneath the barrel that was operated and fed rounds into the action via the lever, which was a vast improvement over the single shot rifles. Now, it was criticized for having an underpowered 44 caliber rimfire bullet, and there was some complaints of issues of reliability with the lever action. However, the ammo capacity and the rate of fire were more than enough to make up for these deficiencies by anyone who actually ever had to use the gun. it was noted that a skilled shooter who had some experience with the gun could accurately empty the 16-round tubular magazine in about a half a minute. And when you think of the fact that the muzzle-loading muskets at the time were getting off 3, maybe 4 shots a minute, it's a marked difference in the amount of firepower that was being brought to the stage. They were only produced over a 7-year run, but during those 7 years, about 14,000 of them were actually produced, which was sufficient that a number of them survived and a number of them headed west, mostly in the hands of Civil War veterans who either actually used them or knew of the reputation they had in terms of their ability to provide an adequate tool both for hunting and defense for the trek westward.
What was the distance that gun could shoot
Accurately about 100 yards. The 44 rimfire was basically a pistol cartridge, and the only advantage that gun as a long arm picked up over the pistols at the time who were shooting that same 44 rimfire was the extra, I think it was a 24 or 26 inch barrel. It was actually a longer barrel than most of the early lever action guns, which actually brings me to the next lever action I want to talk about. The Spencer carbine model, and there was an 1863, there was an 1865. This is the 1865, but they were 50 caliber and were just really, really well-regarded guns. Over 100,000 were produced during the war, and thousands of surplus Spencers made their way to the frontier in the hands of, again, war veterans and even active duty soldiers. There were some soldiers who, even though they'd stopped being active issue weapons, would keep their Spencers from their Civil War days and take them with them to face the Indians on the plains during the Indian Wars. It was a unique design. Again, it had a tubular magazine, but as you can see, it's not under the barrel. It's actually in the stock of the gun. And because that was a bit shorter, it only held 7 or 8 rounds, depending on how many you could cram into the tube at the time. Of course, having those 7 or 8 rounds in the tube, and I didn't bring it in because it was getting too detailed. I'm just going to touch on it. There was the ability to carry reloading tubes in a sort of satchel over your shoulder that contained additional tubes that you could do quick reloads of pulling out the magazine, inserting the new one, reinserting the magazine, and reloading. It basically allowed even the most average marksman to fire at a rate of about 20 shots a minute. So again, it's comparable to what the Henry was, and it was a much more powerful cartridge. It was useful for hunting large game, including buffalo, as well as having a much greater stopping power with a single shot than the Henry had. This carbine was so popular that, like I said, there were cavalrymen who kept it after they were no longer active issued in the cavalry, and were still using them up to the 1890s. Turn of the century, you could still find these in scabbards on horseback, cavalry soldiers riding around the West. And likewise, because of that reputation and its accuracy and easy handling, being a shorter barreled, it was a favorite on the frontier with lawmen, settlers, and again, active duty military. Another lever action gun that was popular was the 1866 Winchester. As you can see just from looking at it, appears very similar to the 1860 Henry rifle, and is actually, when it first came out, was dubbed the improved Henry because it basically was the same action of a Henry with a couple of improvements. Most importantly, as you can see, that black kind of rectangle with a curved end on the side was a loading gate that allowed you to load the shells into the gun from the side without having to go in, screw off the top of the magazine and put them down the front like you did on the Henry, as well as the fact that it had the wood forearm, which kept you from having to hold a hot barrel while you were shooting it. Over 170,000 of these brass framed lever guns were made between 1866 up until 1898. It was actually produced until the end of the century. That's how popular this gun was. Now, again, it's the same 44 caliber rimfire cartridge as the Henry, so it wasn't very powerful. But the Yellow Boy, which was actually its nickname because of the distinctive brass frame, was an effective medium range weapon, again up to about 100 yards, which is really all you needed for most situations one would find themselves needing a rifle for hunting or protection. But it had a very smooth action and again provided the same effective firepower that the Henry did. Of note, of course, was the fact that not only was this gun used by the settlers in protecting their homesteads, but it was a favorite of early lawmen, and a lot of the surplus guns found their ways into the hands of Native Americans. Sitting Bull was known to have used one, carried one, a lot of pictures of him with his 1866 Yellow Boy. But also one of Custer's favorite scouts, Bloody Knife, favored one and carried one with him throughout his entire time with Custer. And of course, the excavations at Little Bighorn proved that a lot of the Native Americans that Custer's 7th Cavalry faced were using just this gun. Also, it was used by members of the Powell Geographic Expedition that surveyed the Grand Canyon in 1869. And again, the records of famous outlaws in their memoirs or their last words from prison talking about using this gun almost exclusively into the 1890s. Again, a very versatile, effective weapon. And as an aside, the rifle I use when I cowboy action shoot. Now, gone through all the firearms before, and we've talked about how they were a worthy part of the settlers' lives and were the guns that helped win the West. But I think when you're talking settlers and the guns that were almost always in their hands and that were used by most of them on a day-to-day basis, center stage is this gun. because you could probably argue that the one type of firearm that was most widely used across the West was the common smoothbore shotgun. It was incredibly easily procurable back east commercially. They weren't all that expensive in the day, and it really was the most versatile of the guns that you could probably put in a Conestoga wagon and head west. You could use it to hunt literally every small game and every bird out there, so it covered all your hunting needs. It was effective as a tool to drive off any predator who was threatening your crops or your herds, and particularly in the 10 and 12 gauge version that were most prevalent at the time, was incredibly effective in stopping two-legged predators from causing any issues on the homestead. Oh, and this is a bit of a interesting, and shotguns, as you may or may not know, go back hundreds of years before this and have been a staple of everyone's firearm collection going back to the 18th century, where they were called Fowlers in the day. But in terms of their ubiquitous nature out west, even the earlier settlers, pre-war settlers, were carrying shotguns with them, and many have been unearthed at various homestead excavations, and there were actually even a couple found at the Alamo. So not only, again, were we talking about a gun that is going to be effective for protecting your homestead, there were some military applications as well.
How prevalent was it using slugs?
Actually, not, well, the precursor of slugs. There were two ways of doing that. You would either load it like a regular smoothbore musket with a large 68 or 75 caliber single musket ball, going back to the old Revolutionary War days, or you would load a slightly downsized, usually a 54 or 58 caliber Civil War ball with a few smaller 38 or 45 caliber balls around it in a buck and ball configuration. And quite frankly, that was probably, for a defense or military application, the most lethal load you could carry in one of these guns, whether they were muzzle loading or cartridge loading. That's mostly for the muzzle loaders. I don't really know if anyone was actually, because in those days, I don't know if any of you shot shotguns, but know that they have the plastic casing on the shotgun shell now. In the day, it was either a heavy cardboard paper casing or a brass case. And I'm not sure that anyone was actually preloading those with anything other than shot or heavy shot. I'm not sure there was actually ever any slug or ball or buck and ball loaded into those cartridges. So I think the early slug option was more for people who were bringing the muzzle loading percussion fired shotguns with them, as opposed to folks who would have the break open breech loading, either single or double barreled shotguns at the homestead. I'm going to kind of wrap up now. I think we've found our number one, but I wanted to make one sort of brief observation about pistols. Again, we talked about from the earlier picture that Hollywood would have us believe that everyone walked around with a 6-shooter on their hip everywhere they went. Now, notwithstanding the, again, first misconception or falsehood in that presentation is that most people who carried pistols in the post-Civil War era didn't have fancy leather gun rigs with holsters to carry them. For the most part, they carried them in a vest or a coat pocket. They tucked them in their belt or just directly in their pants if they had suspenders and weren't wearing a belt. Matter of fact, not many people realize that in the true account of the gunfight at the OK Corral, the only person on the Earp Doc Holliday side who was wearing a holster was Doc Holliday under his vest, and it was a shoulder rig that carried down in his side. Wyatt had his gun in a pocket. Morgan had his gun in his belt. There weren't a whole lot of folks parading around with fancy Hollywood-style gun rigs with a gun, or even more unlikely, two guns in holsters from their belt at the time. Now, the other thing to note is that, as I mentioned, there weren't a lot of pistols being used by settlers. They just weren't a real effective weapon, and whatever money you could put toward you would have ended up putting toward bringing a pistol with you out west could have been better spent on other goods or other tools. Matter of fact, they weren't really even used universally by cowboys. They were used a bit, but again, not a very effective tool for someone on horseback who is driving cattle and needs to protect from potential rustlers and, more importantly, predators who are going to try to, take a head of cattle here or there for their evening meal. So a lot of trail bosses actually actively dissuaded cowboys from carrying six-shooters because they were viewed as, and this was a quote from a newspaper of the time, not necessarily part of a cowboy's job and only amounted to carrying excess dead weight. So, likewise, doesn't appear to be especially prevalent among cowboys or settlers, given that they had limited range and whatnot. But some of them did make their way into the hands of settlers who would keep one maybe in the house just in case somebody was coming. The average storekeep in a small western town might keep it to defend the store. So I just wanted to, point out a few of those guns really quickly and not get into too much detail, and you'll see a lot of those on the table we have outside. But there was the Colt Walker and the Colt Dragoon, which were big, heavy horse guns, weighed almost 4 pounds apiece, but long barreled and actually packed a wallop, which was a good thing for a close-in fight, but surprisingly accurate out to 20-25 yards, which still is not necessarily an ineffective range for what you might be facing on the frontier. Now this one, again, is another one of my favorites, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on it. But this is the 1851 Colt Navy, which is considered by many probably the best balanced, smoothest handling, and most handsome cap and ball revolver ever made. Nearly 250,000 of these were produced by both the North and the South during the Civil War. So invariably, they would end up in the hands of some settlers. More likely, a lot of the pistoleros, for lack of a better phrase, that went out west to either become lawmen or maybe skirt the edges of the law or become bounty hunters in the post-war world, favored these guns. They weighed literally just a little more than half of the dragoons and the walkers, which was light, which meant that they could actually be carried in a belt, or if you had a holster on your hip, as opposed to the dragoons, which were heavy guns that laid on a mantle or on a table or were in a scabbard on your horse, because just carrying them was brutal. They were chambered in 36 caliber, unlike the earlier Colts, which were 44s, and that wasn't necessarily a powerful chambering, but it was and has been proven to be about the equivalent of a modern .380 automatic, which is still an effective gun, modern gun, and it was incredibly accurate. More importantly, and more about the continued longevity of these guns, is by the 1870s, many of them were converted to take a .38 caliber metallic cartridge, which again made loading easier, made unloading easier, gave you a greater volume of power, greater volume of fire, without sacrificing any of the firepower, because the .38 short Colt cartridge that these were converted for had about the same ballistics as they did when they were loaded with black powder and a round ball.